January 24th, 41 AD, the Palatine Hill. Caligula was 28 years old when the Praetorian Guard cornered him in the underground passage. The first sword thrust came from behind, then another, and another. His German bodyguards found him moments later, bleeding out on the marble floor beneath the palace where Roman emperors lived. The mob tore through the streets of Rome within the hour. They dragged his wife's body through the forum. They smashed her infant daughter's skull against a wall. His uncle Claudius, the stammering, limping man everyone had mocked, was proclaimed emperor by nightfall. And in the frantic days that followed, as Rome tried to make sense of what they'd witnessed, the Senate began constructing a story. Not just about Caligula's cruelty, or his madness, or his megalomania. Those were easy, expected even. No, they needed something darker. Something that would justify what they'd done. Something that would make the murder of an emperor and the slaughter of his family seem not just necessary, but righteous. So they told Rome that Caligula had committed incest with his 3 sisters. But here's what almost no one asks. Did Romans actually believe it? And more revealing, did they even care? This is the story of 3 sisters who became the most powerful women in Rome, and how the men who murdered their brother needed to destroy them too. Not with swords, with words. Because in Rome, you didn't just kill an emperor's body, you killed his memory. You erased him from history so thoroughly that future emperors would fear the same fate. And the most effective way to do that? Accuse him of the one taboo that erases all nuance. The one charge that makes defense impossible. The one word that turns a political assassination into moral necessity. Incest. But to understand what Romans really thought when they heard this accusation, we need to understand something crucial about Roman civilization. In Rome, sex was never just about sex. It was about power, control, legitimacy, the boundaries of the family, the stability of the state. And when 3 sisters threatened to redraw those boundaries, Rome responded the only way it knew how. So let's start with what we actually know. Not the mythology, but the documented facts about Caligula and his sisters. Caligula had 3 sisters, Agrippina, Drusilla, and Livilla. Not by chance, but by design. They were the daughters of Germanicus, Rome's golden boy general, the man who could have been emperor but died too young, possibly poisoned on the orders of Tiberius. These weren't ordinary women. They carried the blood of Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Through their father Germanicus, they descended from Mark Antony. Through their mother Agrippina the Elder, they connected to every major patrician family in Rome. In terms of pure bloodline, they were more legitimate than Caligula himself. And they knew it. Agrippina the Younger was born in 15 AD. She was ambitious, ruthless, and would eventually become the mother of Nero. Historians would call her the most dangerous woman in Roman history. Drusilla was born around 16 AD. She was Caligula's favorite. Everyone agreed on that much. When she died in 38 AD, Caligula's grief was so extreme that he made it illegal for Romans to laugh during the mourning period. He deified her immediately, made her Panthea, a goddess, the first Roman woman ever deified while her memory was still fresh. Livilla, born around 18 AD, remains the most mysterious. The sources barely mention her, and that silence, as we'll see, is revealing. Now here's what makes their story different from every other imperial sibling drama. Caligula elevated them to a level of power no Roman women had ever held while alive. In 37 AD, when Caligula became emperor, he did something unprecedented. He put their faces on Roman coins, their actual faces, their names, Agrippina, Drusilla, Livilla. 3 women, side by side, on the reverse of the imperial currency that circulated throughout the empire. This had never happened before. Women appeared on coins only after death as divine mothers or deified empresses. But here were three living women, sisters of the emperor, their images carried in the purses of soldiers, merchants, and slaves across the Roman world. Caligula went further. He included their names in the annual vows of loyalty. Every year, Roman magistrates and soldiers swore oaths to protect the emperor. Now they were swearing to protect his sisters too, not as passive family members, as political entities worthy of Rome's protection. And when Drusilla died in 38 AD, Caligula didn't just mourn her, he made her a god, immediately. He built her temples, appointed priests, gave her a cult. The Senate, terrified, went along with every demand. So here's the question that matters. What did Romans really think they were watching? Because from where the Senate sat, this wasn't romance. This wasn't perversion. This was a revolution in imperial power. Caligula was creating female symbols of authority so potent that they threatened the entire patrician structure of Roman politics. Women couldn't hold office, couldn't vote, couldn't own property without male oversight. But Caligula was giving his sisters something more dangerous than any of that: public legitimacy. And if sisters could be honored like this, if women could appear on coins and receive oaths and be deified while memories of them were fresh, what stopped them from being named heirs? What stopped them from ruling? The Senate had seen what happened when powerful women got too close to imperial power. They'd watched Livia, Augustus's wife, manipulate succession for decades. They'd seen Agrippina the Elder, Caligula's mother, nearly tear the empire apart with her political ambitions. Now Caligula was institutionalizing female power, making it permanent, giving it form. And Rome's response, after they'd killed him, was to sexualize what they couldn't politically control. They turned a political threat into a sexual scandal. 3 women who'd been too powerful became 3 women who'd been too sexual. Sisters who'd challenged the boundaries of female authority became sisters who'd violated the boundaries of family. But here's the fascinating part. The 2 men who had the most reason to spread the incest accusation never mentioned it at all. Let's talk about Seneca. Seneca the Younger was nearly executed by Caligula in 37 AD. The emperor accused him of having an affair with Julia Livilla, one of Caligula's sisters. The charge was probably fabricated, but the threat was real. Caligula spared him only because someone convinced the emperor that Seneca was already dying of tuberculosis. Then, in 41 AD, the year Caligula was assassinated, Claudius exiled Seneca to Corsica for 8 years. The charge? Adultery with the same sister, Julia Livilla. Think about that for a moment. Seneca spent 8 years on a miserable island, his career destroyed, his reputation ruined, accused of sleeping with Caligula's sister. He had every reason to hate Caligula, every incentive to pile on accusations, every motivation to justify his own exile by painting Caligula as the real pervert, the real violator of sisters. And what did Seneca write about Caligula? He called him a monster. He said nature created Caligula to demonstrate what unlimited vice looked like. He condemned Caligula's cruelty, his arrogance, his contempt for human life. In his work De Ira, on anger, and De Tranquillitate Animi, on peace of mind, Seneca used Caligula as the ultimate example of a tyrant consumed by rage. But Seneca never mentioned incest, not once, not even a hint. Now let's talk about Philo. Philo of Alexandria met Caligula personally. He led a Jewish embassy to Rome in 3940 AD, right when Caligula was at his most erratic. Philo watched the emperor mock his delegation. He witnessed Caligula's demands to be worshipped as a god. He saw the paranoia, the casual cruelty, the megalomania. And immediately after Caligula's death, Philo wrote a book called Legatio ad Gaium, Embassy to Gaius. It's a devastating attack on everything Caligula represented. Philo accused him of murdering family members, of exiling his sisters, of committing countless atrocities against Jews and Romans alike. But Philo never mentioned incest either. Now, I want you to really think about this. These weren't neutral observers. These were Caligula's enemies, men who suffered because of him, men who wrote books specifically to condemn him, men who had absolutely nothing to lose by adding another accusation to the pile. And yet when it came to the most explosive charge imaginable, incest with 3 sisters, they remained silent. There are only 2 rational explanations for this silence. Either it didn't happen, or it was a rumor so unsubstantiated, so obviously political propaganda, that including it would have damaged their own credibility. In Rome, testimony mattered. Direct witness mattered. Fides, trustworthiness, integrity, was the foundation of persuasive argument. Both Seneca and Philo were building cases against Caligula that needed to convince educated Romans. And educated Romans knew the difference between confirmed fact and whispered gossip. If Philo, who was actually in Rome during Caligula's reign, didn't mention incest, and Seneca, who was literally accused of sleeping with one of the sisters, didn't mention it, then we have to ask, where did the story come from? The incest accusation first appears clearly in writing around 121 AD. That's 80 years after Caligula's death. The source is Suetonius, writing his biographies of the Caesars during the reign of Hadrian. By that time, everyone who'd known Caligula personally was long dead. Every senator who'd watched him, every soldier who'd served under him, every plebeian who'd seen him at the games, gone. The conspiracy to kill him, the political calculations that followed, the careful construction of his reputation, all of it buried with the witnesses. What survived was the mythology, and Suetonius was writing in a very particular political moment. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, Caligula's dynasty, had ended 60 years earlier with Nero's suicide. The Flavian emperors had replaced them and ruled for 30 years. Now the Antonines were in power. Nobody ruling Rome had any connection to Caligula's bloodline. Nobody had any incentive to protect his memory. In fact, they had every reason to destroy it. Because new dynasties in Rome faced a legitimacy problem. How do you justify replacing the bloodline of Augustus? How do you convince Romans that the old emperors deserved to fall? You make them monsters. Not just bad emperors, not just cruel or incompetent. Monsters. You make them so thoroughly depraved that their removal becomes morally necessary. You make their crimes so unthinkable that no one questions the violence of their deaths. And the perfect crime for this purpose is incest. Because incest in Rome wasn't just taboo, it was contamination. It polluted bloodlines. It destroyed the family structure that was the foundation of Roman society. The word Romans used was contaminatio, corruption that spread, rot that infected everything it touched. Accuse an emperor of military incompetence, and people will argue about strategy. Accuse him of financial mismanagement, and people will debate economics. Accuse him of cruelty, and people will say, well, this is Rome. Sometimes cruelty is necessary, but accuse him of incest, and there's no debate. No nuance. No, maybe he had his reasons. It's black and white, unforgivable. The kind of charge that justifies everything that came after. And here's the crucial part. By the time Suetonius was writing, no one could contradict him. There were no witnesses left to say, actually, I was there, and that's not what happened. There were no documents preserved to prove him wrong. There was only the story. And the story served a purpose. So let's go back to what Romans actually witnessed during Caligula's reign. Not the mythology written 80 years later, but what people saw with their own eyes. They saw an emperor who elevated his sisters to unprecedented prominence. Coins, oaths, titles, public honors. This wasn't secret. It wasn't whispered about in private. It was official policy, announced publicly, visible to everyone in the empire. The Senate reacted with alarm, but not because of sex. They were alarmed because of power. Remember, the Roman Senate in 37 AD was still pretending that the Republic existed. Augustus had been brilliant at maintaining this fiction. He never called himself emperor. He was princeps, first citizen. He consulted the Senate, held elections, respected tradition. Sure, he had absolute power, but he wore it lightly. He played the game. Tiberius, Caligula's predecessor, had been less subtle, but still maintained the basic courtesies. He withdrew to Capri and let the Senate run day-to-day affairs, even if everyone knew real power lay with him. But Caligula? Caligula stripped away the pretense. He didn't just have absolute power, he flaunted it. He mocked the Senate openly. When they annoyed him, he threatened to make his horse a consul. Not because he was insane, because he was making a point. "You're so useless, my horse could do your job." And with his sisters, he went even further. He wasn't just elevating them, he was demonstrating that imperial power could take any form he wanted. If he wanted to give political authority to women who couldn't legally hold office, he would. If he wanted to put living women's faces on coins, breaking centuries of tradition, he would. If he wanted to make his dead sister a goddess before the Senate could even pretend to deliberate on it, he would. This was the threat. Not sexual scandal, political revolution. The plebeians, the common people of Rome, saw something different. They remembered Germanicus, Caligula's father. Germanicus had been beloved. He was handsome, military successful, kind to soldiers, generous to the people. When he died in 19 AD, possibly poisoned by Tiberius, Rome mourned like they'd lost family. They rioted, they destroyed temples, they cursed the gods for taking him. His widow, Agrippina the Elder, and her children became symbols of that lost potential. When Caligula became emperor in 37 AD, Rome saw it as Germanicus's bloodline finally restored. And when Caligula honored his sisters, the people saw it as honoring Germanicus's daughters, preserving the bloodline they loved. So, when Drusilla died in 38 AD and Caligula's grief consumed him, the plebeians understood. They mourned with him. They accepted her deification not as blasphemy, but as tribute to Germanicus's legacy. The common people weren't scandalized by Caligula's devotion to his sisters. They expected it. Family loyalty was a Roman virtue. Pietas, devotion to family and gods, was fundamental. Excessive? Maybe, but comprehensible. The military saw yet another calculation. Soldiers had loved Germanicus, the great general who'd led them to victories in Germania. They'd nicknamed his toddler son Caligula, little soldier's boot, when he wore tiny military uniform in the camps. When adult Caligula became emperor and honored his sisters, Germanicus's daughters, the legions saw it as respect for their beloved commander's memory. And when Caligula later reorganized the Rhine legions efficiently in 39 AD, they saw a competent military mind, not a madman. The military's perspective mattered because they were the ones who would eventually decide Caligula's fate. The Praetorian Guard killed him, not because of sexual depravity, because of political calculation. Because Claudius, his uncle, offered them more money. Now let's talk about how the incest accusation actually functioned as political propaganda. Claudius became emperor the same day Caligula died. He was proclaimed by the Praetorian Guard in a midnight ceremony, while Caligula's body was still warm. The Senate had no choice but to confirm him. Claudius faced an immediate legitimacy crisis. He'd just benefited from his nephew's murder. The empire had witnessed the slaughter of an emperor, his wife, and his infant daughter. The Praetorian Guard had committed treason by executing their commander. How do you govern after that? How do you convince Rome that this wasn't just a brutal coup? You construct a narrative. You make Caligula's death seem inevitable, necessary, just. And the Senate helped. They had to. They'd either actively participated in the conspiracy or passively allowed it to happen. Either way, they needed the assassination to seem like tyrannicide, not murder. They needed Caligula to be a monster, not just a bad emperor. So they passed damnatio memoriae, erasing of memory. They ordered Caligula's statues destroyed, his coins recalled, his name chiseled off monuments, his acts nullified. But they couldn't destroy the fact that he'd been emperor for 4 years. They couldn't erase everyone's memory of watching him rule. They couldn't explain away every policy, every decision, every public act. What they could do was reinterpret those acts through the darkest possible lens. Those honors to his sisters? Not political innovation, sexual depravity. That grief over Drusilla's death? Not excessive mourning, proof of illicit love. That public prominence of 3 women? Not power-sharing, incest cult. And here's the genius of the incest charge. It was unfalsifiable. You can't prove a negative. How does someone demonstrate that they didn't sleep with their siblings? Especially someone who's dead and can't defend themselves. The accusation relied on interpretation. Caligula gave his sisters political power. Well, why would he do that unless there was something inappropriate between them? He mourned Drusilla excessively. Well, that's suspicious, isn't it? He had them included in loyalty oaths. Well, that's just weird. Every public act of honor toward his sisters could be reframed as evidence of secret depravity. Every demonstration of familial loyalty became proof of something darker. And because Caligula was dead, he couldn't explain, couldn't defend, couldn't provide context. The narrative solidified into fact through repetition. Claudius's regime whispered it, the Senate amplified it, subsequent historians recorded it, and by the time Suetonius was writing, 80 years later, it had become accepted truth. But there's one more layer we need to understand. The sisters themselves weren't passive victims. They were political actors with their own ambitions, and that made them dangerous long before any incest accusation. In 39 AD, just 1 year after Drusilla's death, Agrippina and Livilla were implicated in a conspiracy against Caligula. The plot involved Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, who'd been Caligula's close friend and was possibly Drusilla's widower. The conspirators also included Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Gaetulicus, the powerful commander of the Upper Rhine legions. The plan was apparently to assassinate Caligula and install Lepidus as emperor, with Agrippina positioned as power behind the throne. Caligula discovered the conspiracy. His response was swift and ruthless. He executed Lepidus and Gaetulicus. He exiled his sisters to the Pontine Islands, tiny, miserable rocks off the Italian coast where Rome sent political prisoners. This exile was Rome's real glimpse of how the imperial system treated women who grasped for power. Agrippina and Livilla weren't charged with sexual impropriety. They were charged with treason, political conspiracy, attempting to overthrow the emperor. And here's what's fascinating. This real conspiracy, documented by multiple sources, often gets forgotten in favor of the incest mythology, because the real story complicates the narrative. It shows these women not as victims of their brother's perversion, but as calculating political operators pursuing power through any means necessary. Agrippina the Younger, in particular, embodied everything Rome feared about powerful women. After Caligula's death and her return from exile, she married her uncle Claudius. Then she systematically destroyed every threat to her son Nero's path to power. She probably poisoned Claudius. She definitely manipulated succession laws. When Nero became emperor, she tried to co-rule, putting her face on coins equal to his, sitting behind a curtain during Senate meetings. Nero eventually had her killed, but it took multiple attempts. She survived a collapsing bedroom ceiling, a boat designed to sink with her in it, and at least one assassination squad before finally dying by the sword in 59 AD. Tacitus, writing decades later, described her early relationship with Lepidus during Caligula's reign. In her earliest years, she had employed an illicit relationship with Marcus Aemilius Lepidus as a means to power. Notice the framing. Not she fell in love with Lepidus, not even she had an affair with Lepidus. She employed an illicit relationship as a means to power. That's how Rome understood ambitious women. Every sexual choice was strategic, every relationship transactional, every act of intimacy a move on the political chessboard. So when the Senate later claimed Agrippina had committed incest with Caligula, they weren't inventing the idea that she used sexuality for power. They were applying that framework retroactively, reinterpreting her elevation under Caligula as sexual rather than political. By early 41 AD, multiple plots were swirling around Caligula. The Praetorian Guard was angry. Caligula had humiliated them, underpaid them, and executed some of their commanders. The Senate was terrified. Caligula had threatened to move the capital to Alexandria and leave Rome as a powerless backwater. Claudius was calculating. He saw an opportunity to seize power despite his limp, his stammer, his decades of being dismissed as the imperial family's fool. The leader of the conspiracy was Cassius Chaerea, a Praetorian tribune whom Caligula had mocked relentlessly for having a supposedly high-pitched voice. Roman masculinity was fragile, reputation everything, and Caligula had made Chaerea a laughingstock. The plan was simple. Kill Caligula during the Palatine Games, a festival where the emperor would be surrounded by crowds, distracted by entertainment, vulnerable. January 24th, 41 AD. Midday. Caligula left the theatre through an underground corridor beneath the Palatine Hill. He was heading to the baths. His German bodyguards, fiercely loyal foreign soldiers, had been sent ahead to prepare the way. Cassius Chaerea and his co-conspirators were waiting in the narrow passage. The first blow struck Caligula from behind, hitting his shoulder. Caligula spun around, tried to defend himself. He was 28 years old, healthy, capable. But he was alone in a tunnel with armed men whose entire careers had trained them to kill efficiently. Chaerea struck again, then the other conspirators joined in. Sword thrusts to the chest, the groin, the face. By the time Caligula fell, he'd been stabbed 30 times. The conspirators left his body bleeding on the marble floor and ran to find the rest of the imperial family. They found Caligula's wife, Caesonia. She'd been married to him for just a year, but she'd stood by him through the madness and paranoia. One of the Praetorian Guard ran her through with a sword while she begged for mercy. Then they found Julia Drusilla, not the sister who died in 38 AD, but Caligula's infant daughter, named in her honor. A soldier grabbed the baby and smashed her head against a wall. The German bodyguards, when they discovered what happened, went into a killing frenzy. They hunted through the palace, slaughtering anyone they suspected of involvement. Random senators, Praetorian officers, innocent bystanders who happened to be in the wrong corridor at the wrong time. Meanwhile, Claudius, supposedly hiding behind a curtain, trembling in fear, was found by Praetorian guards. Whether he was genuinely terrified or playing a role, historians still debate. But by nightfall, the Praetorian Guard had proclaimed him emperor, not the Senate, not the people, the soldiers who'd just murdered the previous emperor. The Senate, when they met the next day, briefly debated restoring the Republic. For a few hours, they fantasized about turning back the clock to before Augustus, before emperors, before the facade of the old Republic had fully crumbled. But the Praetorian Guard had already made their choice, and they had the swords. So the Senate confirmed Claudius, and the empire continued as if nothing fundamental had changed. This is when the reconstruction of Caligula's memory began in earnest. Claudius needed to justify the massacre. The Senate needed to explain why they'd allowed an emperor to be butchered. The Praetorian Guard needed to transform treason into righteous action. So they built the mythology. They emphasized Caligula's cruelty. Real enough, documented enough to be credible. They highlighted his megalomania, his claims to divinity, his mocking of the Senate. They collected every rumor, every piece of gossip, every whispered accusation from the past 4 years. And somewhere in this process, the incest charge crystallized. Not all at once, not in official proclamations, but in whispered conversations, in Senate debates about erasing his memory, in Claudius's efforts to distance himself from his nephew's legacy. The sisters were part of this calculus. Agrippina and Livilla were still alive, still in exile on the Pontine Islands. Claudius recalled them almost immediately. Family was family, and he needed all the legitimacy he could gather. But their return created a problem. How do you honor the sisters of the emperor you've just declared a monster? How do you explain why Caligula elevated them without suggesting he might have had good reasons? Answer: you sexualize their relationship. You make it inappropriate. You transform a political elevation into a sexual perversion, so that honoring them now becomes a way of showing you're different from Caligula. You're proper. You understand boundaries. Agrippina the Younger understood this game better than anyone. Within a few years, she would marry Claudius himself, her uncle, despite Roman law technically prohibiting uncle-niece marriages. Claudius had to get the Senate to pass a special law legalizing it. The irony was apparently lost on everyone. The emperor who'd propagated incest rumors about Caligula and his sisters then married one of those sisters himself. But that's how Roman political sexuality worked. Incest was what the Senate said it was, what served political purposes, what helped maintain the fiction of moral order, while powerful people did whatever benefited them. So after all of this, what did Romans really think when they heard the incest accusation? The answer is, it depends entirely on when you ask, and which Romans you're asking. Contemporary Romans didn't think about incest at all. There's no evidence the accusation existed while Caligula was alive. What they thought about was unprecedented female prominence. Some celebrated it, the plebeians who loved Germanicus's daughters. Some were alarmed by it, the Senate watching their patriarchal power structure threatened. Some calculated with it, the military assessing loyalty to the imperial bloodline. But incest wasn't the conversation. The conversation was about power, legitimacy, and how far an emperor could push against tradition. Romans in the generation after Caligula's death were constructing a justification for murder. They needed Caligula to be worse than just a bad emperor. They needed him to be unthinkable. So they collected scandals. They emphasized his worst moments. They reinterpreted his actions through the darkest lens possible. The incest accusation probably emerged during this period as rumor and innuendo, not as documented fact. It circulated in the Senate, in dinner conversations, in the gradual hardening of Caligula's reputation from tyrant to monster. By the time Suetonius wrote, the incest charge had solidified into accepted history. Everyone who could contradict it was dead. The charge served too many purposes: moral exemplum, political warning, entertainment value, to be questioned. Later Romans reading Suetonius probably believed it, or at least accepted it as plausible, because by then, Caligula existed only as mythology, not as a real person anyone remembered, but as a cautionary tale about unchecked power. But here's what we can say about what the accusation revealed. Romans were deeply anxious about female power near the throne. When women accumulated influence, like Livia, like Agrippina the Elder, like Caligula's sisters, Rome responded by sexualizing that power, making it inappropriate, using sexual scandal to delegitimize political authority. Romans used sexual accusations as political weapons, always had, always would. Cicero accused his enemy Claudius of incest with his sister. Political rivals accused Julius Caesar of sleeping with his own mother. Later, Suetonius would accuse Nero of incest with his mother Agrippina. It was a standard move in the Roman political playbook. Romans understood that destroying an emperor's memory required total moral annihilation. Damnatio memoriae wasn't just about chiseling names off statues. It was about constructing a reputation so vile that the murder seemed justified, necessary, even heroic. And most revealing of all, Romans accepted that political power could redefine moral boundaries. Claudius married his niece Agrippina after spending years spreading incest rumors about her and Caligula. The Senate legalized uncle-niece marriage specifically for this union. What was incest under Caligula became strategic alliance under Claudius. This is the dark truth at the heart of Rome's relationship with sexuality. Romans didn't actually have consistent moral boundaries about family, sex, or power. They had political boundaries that they dressed up as moral ones, and those boundaries shifted based on who was emperor, who held power, who needed to be destroyed. So let's go back to that underground corridor on January 24th, 41 AD. Caligula dying on the marble floor, his wife and infant daughter murdered within the hour, his uncle seizing power by nightfall. In that moment, Rome wasn't thinking about incest. They were thinking about the same thing they always thought about when an emperor fell. Who benefits? Who's next? What does this mean for me? The incest charge came later, assembled piece by piece as the regime needed it, as the Senate needed it, as history needed it. And that's the most Roman thing about this entire story. Because Romans didn't just kill their emperors, they killed their memories. They rewrote the past to justify the present. They transformed political threats into sexual scandals, because sex was easier to condemn than power was to resist. Caligula's real crime wasn't sleeping with his sisters. We have no reliable evidence he did. His real crime was revealing that the restored republic was a fiction, that Augustus's carefully maintained pretense of sharing power with the Senate was a lie, that emperors could do anything they wanted, including elevating women to political prominence that threatened every patrician family's control over their own daughters and wives. So Rome destroyed him, and then, because destroying just his body wasn't enough, they destroyed his memory, made him a monster, made his love for his sisters into something grotesque. And in doing so, they revealed more about themselves than about him. They revealed that in Rome, female political power was so threatening it could only be processed as sexual deviance. That ambition in women was so disturbing it had to be reframed as perversion. That three sisters carrying the bloodline of Augustus and the military genius of Germanicus were too dangerous to honor, so they had to be sexualized, minimized, erased. The next time you hear that Caligula committed incest with his three sisters, ask yourself, who told you that story? When did they tell it? And what did they gain by telling it? Because history isn't just what happened, it's what the survivors needed you to believe happened. And in Rome, the survivors were always the ones with the swords and the power to rewrite the past. Caligula was 28 years old when 30 sword thrusts ended his life in a tunnel beneath the palace. 80 years later, a historian would write that he'd committed incest with his three sisters, and that accusation would echo through history for 2,000 years. But the senators who spread that rumor, the emperors who benefited from it, the historians who recorded it, they all understood something crucial about power and memory. The dead can't defend themselves. And sometimes, that's the whole point.